Welcome to day 3 of the Technology Driving Transition Global Summit here in Glasgow for COP26. It's been a couple of fascinating days in which we have investigated transition strategies from places around the world. I'm very glad to have you in the room today, having a live audience again, but also thankful to all those people. I know there are many and many that are following us online. COP is going on. It's getting interesting, isn't it? We heard some progress. We heard an announcement about methane, about deforestation, and also South Africa phasing out coal for energy. Clearly, more needs to be done, and more needs to be discussed, debated, and agreed over the next 10 days. But here, we are doing our part. And our part is, of course, about technology, being a technology center. And it is about technology innovation. But it's also about collaboration. And collaboration has been the name of the game for the past couple of days, in which we have had 10 additional technology centers from literally around the world debating and uncovering strategies and technology for decarbonization. And today we're going to wrap it up. But before we do so, I'd like to welcome on stage Colette Cohen, the CEO of Net Zero Technology Center. And Colette, if you can give us your takeaways for these 2 days and maybe introduce our keynote speaker, if it's arrived. If it will arrive. It is arrived.
This is all getting better. Okay. Lovely. Thank you, Luca. So I think it's fair to say when we set this whole event up, we didn't really know how smoothly it would go or what kind of turnout we would get or actually how it would feel to be in the room and in these conversations with these other research and technology organizations from around the world. But I think what we've discovered is there's a huge amount of commonality. The language is actually much more similar than we would have expected. The challenges are also incredibly common. So we've heard some from Brazil, from the UK, from the Netherlands, from Canada, from the US, and Australia. It's been a really interesting and enlightening few days. We've also been lucky enough to hear from the Cabinet Secretary for Net Zero, Energy and Transportation. We've heard from Andy Samuel, the CEO from the Oil and Gas Authority. And now, today, we are lucky enough to be closing with Lord Offord, who is going to give us his perspectives and encouragement, I think, for our direction around climate change and the investment in technology that's required. So, you're very welcome.
Thank you very much. Colette, I'll just get my notes. There we go. Thank you, Luca. Is this working? Yes, it is. Good. Okay, thank you all. So just arrived here again in Glasgow. I've been here the last 3 days, popping around the city. It looks absolutely brilliant, doesn't it, in the sunshine? And so we're just here I'm the newly appointed Minister of the Scotland office. My name is Malcolm Offord. And basically just getting the message out from a UK point of view about what we're doing, what COP is all about, and how this whole thing fits together. So it's great to be here at the Net Zero Technology Centre, and thank you for inviting me to your summit. And it's a privilege to join a distinguished group such as you, because this is a complex challenge, and we're trying to make a reality of our shared desire to tackle climate change and transition to a greener, more sustainable economy. So earlier this week in Edinburgh, I attended a celebration of Diwali with the Hindu community. It's quite interesting because obviously it's a festival of light observed by millions around the globe. And there's quite a lot of discussion about how's Diwali, what's the relevance of that in COP26. And the metaphor was quite striking. The idea of light overcoming darkness, wisdom triumphing over ignorance. And those themes seem to strike a chord with COP26 and what we can achieve here in Glasgow. Because we need to have some bright flame of hope, don't we, in these troubled times, and the world needs to come together, as they're doing here, to strike a meaningful accord. And the key to it is going to be innovation and technology, and that's what you're showcasing as part of your summit here today. Technological development is going to be key to this endeavour, and in order to accelerate progress, it's vital we identify the technology gaps and develop solutions for the real-world challenges across a range of sectors, and I think that's a key contribution that the UK can make. The other big theme I think that's come through with COP26 is collaboration. This cannot be done by one individual silo or sector or government. It needs to be a partnership between government, public sector, private sector, scientists, business, and we talked earlier this week about the North Sea transition deal, and that's a very good example of how that's working between the public sector, the private sector, governing regulatory authority. So collaboration is the catalyst to technological advancement, and international collaboration will accelerate the growth to net zero. And academics and scientists need to work hand in hand with industry and governments to deliver this. So here we are in the first week of the COP26. It's drawn together a great gathering with a common aim. And it's actually an astonishing example of international collaboration. I mean, it's early days yet, we're just in day 3. But it is striking to me that we are in Glasgow, where the first industrial revolution began, and with James Watt and steam engine down in Greenock, to here being the 4th industrial revolution, and we're back in Glasgow. And I think it's very fitting that we're doing that here today. The UK government, together with Italian partners, have been working hard to ensure the summit is given the best possible opportunity to reach this key agreement about global temperatures rising no more than 1.5 degrees C. If we don't act, we know the stats at the end of the century, the world will be at 3 degrees C, and we know that will cause catastrophic flooding, droughts, wildfires, extreme weather, and destruction of species. I mean, I was in Mumbai 2 weeks ago on my first overseas visit, and they were talking about the monsoons and the cyclones that are coming in, and the farmers' crops. All the normal patterns of monsoon going to harvest have all been disrupted. The last major cyclone they had was something like 132 years ago. They've had 2 in the last 2 years, wiping out all the farmers' crops. So the point being made there is that this is no longer viewed as just being a high-level scientific issue. This is actually affecting real people's lives. So the challenges are great, daunting even, but we're building on solid foundations. And what's the UK's role in all this? You know, at the end of the day, we contribute 1% of global emissions. So you might argue that whatever we do doesn't move the needle. But the point of being here today, the whole COP26, whole UK, I think, position is to be the great persuader of other nations as to how to do this. And one of the key things that we can show is our track record in the last 30 years, since 1990, because we've actually cut our emissions by 44%. We have a target to get to 78% by 2030, but we're currently at 44% in 2021. But we've grown our economy by 78% in that period. So we're sort of on track to sort of saying we are going to have our emissions and double our economy. And I think that's the key transition piece on this, which is not, we cannot go backwards in terms of prosperity in this debate. We have to take the public with us. Technology will be the answer to this, but we have to grow our economy at the same time as cutting our emissions, and that is the holy grail. That is the net zero paradigm that we're all going after. Because at the end of the day, we've got to keep the lights on in our homes, schools and hospitals. We've got to keep industry open. So coming to Scotland, you know, I always say Scotland, 8% of the population of the UK, 33% of the geography, 60% of the brains. You know, sitting here and being here in Glasgow, we were just remarking on the fact that what an incredible educational campus Glasgow has become. This is Strathclyde, right in the heart of the city. We've got Glasgow City College, which has brought together all the technical colleges into one. We've got Glasgow Caledonian University next door. And then we've got Glasgow University and the Royal Conservatoire. I mean, it's an extraordinary situation that in one city like this, we have this amount of education, innovation, right back to where we started 200 years ago. The Industrial Revolution started here because of engineers, because of technologists. This problem will be solved here in this city, in Scotland, by the same old brains that we've had for 200 years. And that's what that's what UK, I think the role of the UK has to offer the world. So obviously we can't overstate the importance of energy transition. The transition is the key word. But we're in the foothills, of what I believe will be seen to be a revolution in energy. Time is pressing. The stakes couldn't be higher as we search for solutions to the global climate crisis. I mean, again, I was on a panel yesterday with a whole bunch of academic scientists saying, you know, the scientists knew about this in 1990. We're referring always to 1990, what we've done since 1990. And what they're saying is the emissions since 1990 to this point have created almost 50% of the problem that we're dealing with now. So are we 30 years later, are we too late? Well, we are where we are. that's maybe why the phrase is being used as 1 minute to midnight, that we have to get on with this. We are where we are, but you know, we've got to really press ahead now. So there's no time for despondency, quite the opposite. And this is a time for action guided by the sure hands of science and innovation. So the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson's 10-point plan for a green revolution was published in November 2020. And it's rooted in this approach, this twin approach. Can we deliver prosperity and deliver green revolution? Which is ambitious, but we make no apology for that. We've made significant commitments across renewables, such as offshore wind, and in important developing technologies and markets such as carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, nuclear, marine, and clean transport. As we've said, Scotland's at the forefront of our efforts. On offshore wind, for example, Scotland's got huge potential. Our commitment is to quadruple capacity in Scotland. And this week we've earmarked 160 million to develop floating wind farms which can operate in Scotland's deeper waters to harness greater wind speeds. A responsive and reliable electricity grid is essential to transitioning to net zero. So we're breaking down barriers to flexibility with a smart systems plan, which also looks at long duration storage, flexible heating systems, and interconnection can save the UK up to 10 billion by 2050 and create 24,000 jobs. All more steps towards net zero. So by 2030, the UK hydrogen sector could be worth 900 million and support over 9,000 jobs. The UK government's hydrogen strategy is designed to take full advantage of this emerging industry, and we're well positioned to secure a competitive advantage in both green and blue hydrogen. With the largest offshore wind sector in the world to help power the creation of hydrogen and essential carbon capture assets with an abundance of required rock strata under our seas. So the UK government is determined to build further on the progress we've made to date, and just 2 weeks ago, with the net zero strategy, we've set out the measures to transition to a green and sustainable future. And the numbers are big numbers. The government has basically put together a plan, 10-point plan, which mobilises 30 billion of government capital for the green industrial revolution, and leveraging on that, we've paired that with 90 billion from the private sector. So the 90 billion is basically helping businesses and consumers in every part of the country move to clean power, supporting hundreds of thousands of well-paid jobs, and that's where the 90 billion leverages with the 30 being 120. So this will drive progress further, and it will level up the UK. These will be high-paid jobs. It will support 190,000 jobs in the middle of the 2020s, and up to 440,000 jobs in 2030. So we are proud in the UK to lead the charge here, lead the world in the drive to slash our own contribution to climate change, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because we're determined to seize the unprecedented economic opportunity it also brings. We want to build back better after the pandemic by building back greener and levelling up our country with a new, highly skilled, high-wage, sustainable jobs in every part of the UK. These jobs will be spread across the UK. So we've got specialists in low-carbon fuels in Northern Ireland, we've got low-carbon hydrogen in Sheffield, electric vehicle battery production in northeast of England, and more engineers in Wales, offshore wind technicians in Scotland. So the government has just unveiled a landmark commitment to decarbonise the UK's electricity system by 2035, and we're saying we want to be rid of coal by 2024. And if you take coal, for example, I mean, 10 years ago, coal was powering 40% of our energy, now it's 2%. So it just shows it can be done, and it can be done fast. And so we're going to build a homegrown energy sector which is less reliant on fossil fuels and less exposed to volatile global wholesale energy prices that we've just seen, obviously, with gas this year. So the strategy gives a clear direction, and it gives businesses and industry the certainty they need to invest, grow, and make the UK the home of new ambitious projects and innovative technologies. It shows how the government is working with, in collaboration with them, to help bring down the costs of key technologies from electric vehicles to heat pumps, and to give the UK a competitive edge. So again, if you take something like solar panels, you know, they are now costing 10% of what they cost 10 years ago. So we're talking about, you know, heat pumps. How does the ordinary man move and put a heat pump in their house? Well, because in 10 years' time, it might be 10% of the price it is today. The government's job is to prime this, get this started, and then the private sector should come in behind and the technology will come in behind this. So I believe all this demonstrates the UK's government commitment to green recovery by continuing to support and invest in new and innovative technologies and further expansion of the renewable energy sector. We have identified the targets, but that's far from all we're doing. We're delivering now on what we set out to achieve with industry, government and the public together. The decisions COP needs to make to deliver results are difficult, and we know that right now it's on a knife edge as we strive for a cleaner, greener, more sustainable world for all. The willingness is there, and the technology has put the tools we need in our hands. So I think the last thing to say really is that when, our job is to be the great persuader in this debate, and we have to therefore be responsible about how we move our own economy forward and our own action on climate change. When UK took over the chairmanship of COP, or the presidency of COP26, we had 30% of the world pollution, by country as it were, signed up to net zero, and today we've got 80%. So the UK, I think it's fair to say, has shown a lead in persuading people to come on this journey with us. And again, being back in Glasgow, it's just fantastic. I think that, could it be said that we saved the world in Glasgow? Could that be that what COP26 is remembered for? And that's something we should all be very proud of. So thank you all very much.
Quite inspirational. Thank you very much. I think it sets the scene for today and for where we need to go now. I think it's quite interesting that you bring up the sort of origin of the industrial revolutions and the fact that many times when we talk about climate change, we think about it as being a problem that's nearly occurred in the last 30 years, but actually it is embedded in the very first industrial revolution and where we've gone from there. So it's quite a complex challenge that we're all here trying to solve. And I think sometimes we simplify it too much and we make the answer to yes or no, particularly when we're dealing with oil and gas, which, switches on, switches off. It's not quite that simple. So it's really encouraging to be here today to sort of pull together the last 2 days of discussions between these amazing research organizations from around the world. I mentioned earlier that I thought the language was amazingly common. The way the challenge we have to decarbonize our basins, but also the willingness, and that's the sort of focus of all of these amazing research organizations, that we are all on this journey to try and bring our own industry to a net zero future. So I find that quite exciting, and I certainly hope that this is just the start of our collaboration. We may have brought so many together, but now it is very much about delivery. It's very much about how can we turn all of these great words into actions. And so ultimately, that's what we're here to talk about today. Today is pulling that together. It's the next steps. It's where do we go? How do we work together? How do we turn good intention into real delivery and results? So we're here to talk about this study, which is why I'm holding it in my hand, which ultimately these 11 organizations have come together and said, okay, we've been looking at the technologies that you need to transition and accelerate your journey to net zero. We've been looking at the technology gaps, but there's opportunities for us to work together. There's opportunities for us to really accelerate some of these technologies. But we need to understand that more. We need to do some work together to really understand what can we do and where is the commonalities. So this particular study is going to be on the technology priorities for a net zero integrated energy system. This builds on some work we did in the last year, which is looking at the North Sea as an integrated energy system. And that seems to be, for us, the journey that our industry needs to go on. It capitalizes on our infrastructure, our skills, our knowledge, but also accelerating us to this blue, green hydrogen, accelerating the integration of offshore wind in particular in many of the basins. It also looks at direct air capture. It looks at carbon sequestration, carbon utilization, which was one of the prize-winning company at the pitch battle yesterday. So I think it's a really exciting time, and we have a little video to start. If we could play the video, please. Super. So 11 organisations around the world. The language I've said this week is about so many of these common problems, which means we're researching and investing in very similar challenges. If we could combine our research, if we could understand where the commonalities really lie, because the devil is in the detail. If it was simple, we'd have all done it already. But this is an opportunity for us to understand where the detail is, understand where the challenge is, and come together then with a plan of how that will work. So today is about making a bit more of a plan on what we're going to do and really digging into that. And that's what Luke is going to lead now. But I'm super excited that we're then going to bring the results of this study and this work to COP27 and continue this conversation and ensure that we really do help deliver the change that all of us need to get to net zero and deliver the targets as nations and globally we need. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Colette, and thank you very much, Minister, for your kind words. So yes, today marks the start of a journey, of a collaborative journey with this organization, but today also is the sum up, the wrap up of these 2 days of exploring, of presentations. And so for those of you that were not here with us yesterday and the day before, and I see new faces in the room, and I'm sure there are plenty of new faces online as well, we thought, okay, to help you refresh your memory if you were here, but also give you a kind of a summary of what has been discussed. What are the key themes? Colette mentioned the similarities, some common language. So what are the key themes that emerges? And around those key themes, later on, we're going to have a debate and panel discussion among a subgroup of these international centers. But for now, a little bit of a refresher of what happened in the last couple of days. If we can have the 10 minutes of video summarizing the highlights of the past 2 days, please.
Message, and quite rightly, as part of COP26, and this is about working together and scale and pace for economic recovery. And quite important, this is really an area where by innovating, we are going to thrive, we are going to increase trade, we are going to attract inward investment to the regions.
During the summit, some common themes emerged from the presentations. Let's hear the highlights.
Hydrogen is a robust solution in this energy system, and it will be a balanced mix of blue and green hydrogen production. Offshore hydrogen production is becoming economic once you move to distances further offshore of about 100 kilometers and on a large scale, gigawatt scale, where it could be implemented on platforms but also on energy islands.
So our challenge in Australia is to get production of hydrogen under $2, and that's $2 Australian. Once we get that, the actual opportunities for hydrogen really take off. One thing we're also looking to do in Australia is actually bundle up our fantastic technology companies in the hydrogen space and develop a super cluster. And that's where we can really help collaborate and drive new opportunities, helping them export into our traditional export markets, but also into new emerging hydrogen markets in Europe, North America.
For green hydrogen, the cost is so closely associated with the production of the electricity. However, areas such as seawater electrolysis can help remove desalination costs, new catalyst materials can increase efficiency, and subsea systems could mitigate the requirement for costly power transmission.
One single offshore salt cavern can store up to 8 million tons of CO2 in the pre-salt fields of the Santos Basin.
With bioenergy, with carbon capture and storage, with ethanol, we can reduce in up to 5% Brazil's emissions with energy production.
Developing the Acorn project based out of St Fergus in northeast Scotland, where a lot of oil and gas pipelines come onto the shore, bringing oil and gas from the North Sea onto the shore, but 3 at least of those now have become vacant with the decrease of oil and gas production. And so the philosophy of the Acorn project is to do the minimum viable project to reuse an existing available pipeline where we know what the pipeline is built, and we know that can be reused at very rapid time with very little expenditure, taking carbon dioxide from the land out to storage in this capped-in sandstone.
We're working on bitumen beyond combustion, so converting heavy hydrocarbon molecules into value-added carbon-based products. Instead of burning it for energy, we're working on spinning carbon fiber from asphaltene here in Alberta for use in industrial and consumer products, such as aggregates, composites, and other advanced materials.
Into hydrogen as solid carbon without CO2 emission. Why is now the right time to look into this process? Well, recent technological developments that happened really in the last 2 decades have allowed scalable processes to new forms of solid carbon, such as carbon nanotubes and graphene. So now you have scalable processes that allow you to simultaneously harvest clean hydrogen energy while creating sustainable carbon materials with high use value and low environmental footprint.
Carbon capture and storage is still needed to minimize the socialized cost of energy transition, which will also enable the introduction of blue hydrogen and also allow on the long-term negative emissions.
There's very large renewable resource across Northern Australia and including in the Northern Territory region, a very large photovoltaic power potential. And there are a number of proposed mega renewable projects under development, one of which is Sun Cable, which is going to be based in the Northern Territory in this sort of area, which is $22 billion investment, 10 gigawatt solar farm scheduled for 2026 to come online.
Water for Energy Services, in partnership with SciTech, are studying the feasibility of using floating wind energy to power offshore assets such as mobile offshore drilling units. The project plans to use these units as a test case to identify technology gaps associated with real-world use of floating wind power for offshore assets.
And as Jeff noted, the power system in the United States is becoming increasingly dependent on natural gas. So it's important that these compressor stations, which are operated on grid electricity, very large amounts of grid electricity, are able to transmit that gas to the power stations. And so we've been looking at the options for using renewable energy technologies such as solar and wind and others at these sites. And our analysis found that it's very cost effective to have smaller PV sites at these.
Standardized UK specific floating offshore wind foundations coupled with innovative mooring systems and cabling solutions will help drive down the cost of floating offshore wind, ensuring that the UK's deep water wind resource can be unlocked. So the UK has a predicted range of exploitable offshore wind in the region of 95 to 250 gigawatts. Similarly, we have large potential tidal resource and a surprisingly high solar resource. Corresponding to this large renewable resource is a great potential for green hydrogen.
And we are looking into our program how much CO2 emissions and NOx emissions can be saved. What are the options for developing an electric integrated grid to connect all these offshore platforms to one another in the offshore system and then connect it to the wind parks, which are in green on this picture. And we found out that you can save quite a lot of cost from this electric infrastructure if you optimize it.
Duction Motors will develop the world's first 400 kilowatt hybrid diesel-electric propulsion system that can be retrofitted to in-service offshore vessels without the need for dry docking or significant drive shaft modifications.
Specifically looking at how we can look at electrification of well pads and oil and gas drilling and extraction. So this is using microgrid technology that we developed for remote communities and islands, looking at powering these oil and gas operations at the upstream through solar, through fuel cells, hydrogen, batteries, wind power, and then connecting these through a microgrid and a controller that will optimize these for both for cost as well as emissions reduction. And this could also potentially increase resiliency during power outages.
Alternative fuels and electrification will be critical to ensure production emissions are negated, ensuring our native oil and gas industry has a license to operate and provide the vital resource the UK will require beyond 2050.
Why the industrial clusters are important? In the UK, they actually have around over 50% of the emissions from industry come from these clusters. But what is also very, very important to remember here is that these clusters already set infrastructure. They already have skills. So they can be very easily the first ones in demonstrating the deployment of these technologies, the first adopters of these new technologies. And these clusters, as I said before, they are going to be these super places where we have renewable energy, where we have also CCUS, and we have hydrogen, and all this is happening at the forefront of this technology development.
Clustering is a well-known concept, especially through Europe and in Australia, where we're looking to build 15 regional hydrogen clusters and coming from the ground up. Those 15 are then coming into a national network and working together to collaborate on opportunities, technologies, applications that can really drive the cost of hydrogen down, but also the applicability of decarbonising many different sectors throughout Australia.
The Carbon Conversion Centre continues as a test centre going forward for carbon capture and use, research and development, and will also be installing and hosting methane decarbonisation work at that same location. So just imagine a mini industrial complex focused on R&D on the synergies between methane, hydrogen, carbon, electricity, and water.
By 2050, we get a real picture of that integrated energy system, with much of the oil and gas activity replaced by carbon capture, offshore wind and hydrogen production. There's also a big opportunity for the UK to become a net exporter of energy. So green hydrogen can be transported either by pipeline or ship to markets in Europe and beyond, should we choose to transform our energy system over the next 30 years.
There is potential to reuse existing infrastructure as fields come on to the end of the life, and that has the potential to reduce upfront capital cost for the development of a hub. And Santos have recently come out and talked about the reuse of Bayu-Undan pipeline and well infrastructure as part of a CCS project in the region.
And then the last option, which is very attractive at the moment, is actually converting offshore wind power to hydrogen on existing platforms or on new platforms or even energy islands. And then all the energy can be transported to shore via pipelines, which can save a lot of costs on transport via power cables and high voltage DC conversion systems. The Poseidon pilot, it's offshore hydrogen production on an existing live oil and gas producing platform of Neptune Energy. And we are feeding green energy from a nearby wind park to the platform, thereby splitting seawater into hydrogen and oxygen. Of course, the seawater is desalinized first, and then the hydrogen is mixed with the natural gas and produced to shore with the natural gas. And this is a small-scale pilot, 1 megawatt, but it's to demonstrate and learn about offshore hydrogen production.
To achieve net zero, we will need many solutions. There is no silver bullet solution to this challenge. And in our planning related to net zero, we should maximize synergies with existing energy systems and maintain that value of the investments that have already been made to date.
And there we go. That was 11 presentations in 11 minutes. So each of these presentations was 10 minutes, so that's a 10% reduction. But if you want to refresh on watch them, there are now, the previous 2 days are available on the Hop-In platform and on our YouTube channel, and if you want to get more into the detail of them. You see that some common themes emerge, and we brought together those common themes. And so what we are going to do today is, after the presentation, is start the discussion, because the language is similar, the themes are similar, but maybe the approach is different, and maybe there are different interpretations around the world. That's what we want to uncover, and that's what the work that we have announced today and going to start immediately after COP will work on and will uncover. So we have grouped these themes into sub-panel, because it's difficult to have a panel with 11 speakers or 11 presenters, so they're short, smaller panels by topic. And I'd like to start with the first one. And the first panel is about energy system integration. And I think it's fair to say that the narrative about the relationship between the oil and gas industry and renewable has moved from competition to integration. We recognize the complexity of the system and the nature of the transition, which is not an immediate switch. And so a lot of that is happening on that front. And so in some cases, it's about building an integrated energy system. It's about powering offshore oil and gas with renewables. In some other is combining different sources in energy island. Sometimes it's reusing and repurposing some of this infrastructure for offshore renewables or for hydrogen, as we heard about pipelines. So that is the challenge. And before I introduce the panel, I have a question for the audience, and using the slide both online and here. If we can have the question on the top. This is the slide. Yes, okay, that's the question. So what should we prioritize? What do you think are the key priorities in making this energy system integration happening? What should we focus on our study in the next 12 months? All of them, or some of them more than others? Repurposing of infrastructure, as I said? Or the sharing of infrastructure across the various energy sources, or gas and CCS to compensate for renewables intermittency is an integrated energy system, or offshore energy hubs, so artificial island or natural island where energy conversion and distribution is condensed and integrated, or anything else that you can answer. So the people online can answer this on the Hop-In platform on your right-hand side of your screen, and the people in the room can use their own devices. And while you answer, I'll take that time to invite the panel members to the stage. So Martin Tulloch, Energy System Integration Program Lead at the Net Zero Technology Center. We heard from Jason, because we recorded that speech, but Martin's been presenting yesterday. If you can join me on stage, please. And I'd like to also welcome from Brazil, and very pleased to have you here, Professor Giulio Meneghini, Scientific Director at the Research Center for Greenhouse Gas Innovation, RCGI, of the São Paulo University in Brazil. And then joining us online are René Peters, Director of the Gas Technology Energy Transition at TNO in the Netherlands. Hi René, good to see you. And Jill Engel-Cox from Denver, Colorado, from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Great to have you here. So I hope we have some results from the poll we submitted. Can we share the results, and maybe we can start from there. Ooh. So there's a clear preference for the repurposing of infrastructure, 55%, followed by offshore energy hubs, 32%, sharing of infrastructure, 26%, and is moving, and a lower level for the gas and CCS to compensate the intermittency. So let me start asking our panelists, and maybe I'll start with you, Martin. Do you agree with that? Does it surprise you? What's your reaction to that poll?
No, it doesn't surprise me. I think all four of those are going to be hugely important as we move to an integrated system. If I was voting, I'd probably have voted for the one at the bottom there. I think balancing the intermittency of renewables with hydrogen and potentially CCS is going to be absolutely crucial. I've just finished reading a book by a compatriot of yours, Marco Alvera, The Hydrogen Revolution. He's got a chapter in there where he calls electricity and hydrogen the power couple, because you get days like this. I took the train down from Aberdeen today, and pretty much all the wind turbines in the way had stopped. So we're hugely reliant on gas power at the moment. And I think, as I mentioned in my presentation, that's going to have to be clean gas power in 2050. So to me, yeah, there's that balancing piece, but also infrastructure repurposing. The European onshore hydrogen backbone's doing some fantastic work looking at the cost benefits of repurposing existing infrastructure. So that I think is something we need to replicate in the offshore. But really keen to hear views from the rest of the panel as well.
Since you mentioned Europe and you mentioned offshore, maybe I'll go to René next. Does that surprise you?
Yes. Yeah, I wasn't surprised here because I voted for reuse of infrastructure as well. Actually, because on all the options that we have been discussing, repurposing of infrastructure could actually enable this transition. Like CO2 storage, we will be using depleted gas fields. There was this example of reusing pipelines for CO2 to these depleted fields. But also for hydrogen, I gave the example of the offshore hydrogen production pilot that we're starting, the Poseidon project. We are actually repurposing the platform, which is actually still an operating platform of oil and gas, but we use it for the electrolysis, for hydrogen production, and we're repurposing the pipeline to transport the hydrogen to shore. So actually repurposing assets that are still valuable and technically also sound for this transition, where we need the integrated system of molecules and electrons, actually reduces costs, it accelerates transition, and it actually gives also an efficient use of space. And I think these three elements are relevant for energy system integration. You can save space, you can accelerate, and you can reduce societal cost and upfront investment in capital.
Thank you, René. And Jill, if I can come to you, your presentation talks about the integration between renewable sources and gas in the US. So can you give us a perspective of what you think is the priority from a technology innovation perspective? Where should we prioritize our efforts and focus?
Yeah, so many opportunities, and just to reflect a little bit on the repurposing of infrastructure, which also gives us the technology priorities, is that you're not only repurposing the infrastructure, you're repurposing the people, the knowledge, the financing, all of those elements. So that's going to be really important to bring this reality to bear going forward. In terms of the technology opportunities, obviously we're already transitioning our power system to renewables and to other types of clean energy systems. So converting a lot of these industrial processes to electricity where possible, that's going to be critical. There's a lot of technologies that are available to do that, but they need research and advancements to get them to a lower cost. And then as was mentioned a little earlier, starting to look at the fuels, the materials, the chemicals. Most of that has not really been evaluated into how we bring that to a clean energy infrastructure, and how do we integrate the power system with the fuels and the chemicals and the material systems together. We tend to look at these things in very siloed ways, and really they're a single energy system. And then finally, how do we look at that circular economy? How do we bring all this together at end of life and bring these things back together so you're not using as much energy in the creation of these, you're being able to return to them back into a single system.
Thank you, Jill. And next I come to you, Giulio. You painted a picture of the complexity of the Brazilian energy system between the onshore, the offshore, the role of the Amazon forest. What do you think should we focus from a technology innovation perspective in unlocking and making that energy integration, integrated energy system a reality faster?
Yeah, as you said, the Brazilian case is complex because we still have a lot of oil fields that are still being developed, and then we don't have depleted oil fields. They are going to start appearing in the next couple of years, the first regions that we are going to be able to do CCS. But I think that we have the opportunity to start with those new technologies, as has been mentioned, the production of hydrogen offshore. I think it's something that Brazil, the associated gas that comes with the oil production offshore in Brazil. Now Brazil is among the 10 biggest producers of oil and gas. And then we have the opportunity to develop a particular infrastructure to use the methane that comes with the associated gas, and at the same time, as Gustavo has mentioned in one of the presentations, to use and to develop huge caverns to store CO2 in the salt layer of the offshore platforms, or of the offshore oil basins where we produce oil and gas in Brazil, most of the oil gas. Then we have that problem, that opportunity, the offshore sites to do CCS, and at the same time, if you go onshore, I think that Brazil could improve a lot the ethanol production. I called yesterday the third generation of ethanol that, different from the US, we don't use shale gas to heat up during the fermentation process. We use bagasse. And then where is our CO2 footprint in the ethanol production? It comes from the use of diesel, because the harvesting machine, they still are run by diesel, and if we use biomethane, we would reduce the CO2 footprint of the ethanol production, and together with the capture of the pure CO2 from the fermentation process, we could really do something that, well, we could do CCS or CCU with that pure CO2. And then we believe that our ethanol, this third generation ethanol, could become slightly negative in terms of CO2 footprint. It's my dream to drive a E100 car in Brazil that would be somehow helping to capture a bit of CO2 in the whole process. But before that, we really have to remove the diesel from the equation of the production and starting capturing and using the CO2 for other process.
Thank you. And on like the dream, moving away from using fossil fuel car, but also is a matter of how quick can we move away from using fossil fuel for power generation and for energy generation. And you mentioned, Martin, the intermittency element, the integration. Clearly, storage becomes a key element of that. If you can store the electricity, the clean electricity from wind or solar into battery or into other means of storing long term. So is there anything that we are looking at, what technology are required in the next 10, 20 years to accelerate, to make that a reality?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we're looking at long duration energy storage as one of our roadmap priorities. I know Philip is going to be talking later on behalf of SCCS, and I think Scotland's got a pocket of excellence in geological storage of hydrogen that we can hopefully maybe share with the rest of the technology centres. I think likewise, it'd be really interesting to see, and that, to me, is one of the most valuable aspects of this collaboration, is trying to pull in the pockets of excellence from other parts of the world. And I know Chill's group have done some work on the nuclear contribution to a combined energy system, which is something we've maybe overlooked a little in this country. So yeah, I think long duration energy storage is something that's going to be hugely important. We're focusing on geological storage of hydrogen because that fits in with our own resource base in the UKCS, but really keen to learn from the other organisations as well.
So maybe we can ask Renee and Jill next. What is the perspective there in terms of storage for energy?
Yeah, I think Martin mentioned the storage in either depleted gas fields or salt caverns. We're also looking in the Netherlands, because in the north we have quite some potential for storage in salt caverns. Actually, one pilot project underway, and we also look at offshore storage, indeed more in depleted gas fields. So that I think is needed if we want to balance the system. And actually, that's where energy system integration also comes together, because as you said, the power couple is electrons and molecules, hydrogen and green electrons. And by looking at integrated systems, we try to bring the benefits of both together. So we are now able to make very cheap electricity, cheap electrons from solar and wind and potentially also hydro and others. But we are not so good in storing electricity over in large volumes over larger periods of time. And that's where the benefits from hydrogen come in, because hydrogen you can store easily and at low cost in large volumes without many losses, and you can transport it over large distances at low costs. So looking at integrated solutions, we take the benefit of both. We have cheap energy, we convert it to hydrogen, and we have all the storage and balancing options to create a balanced energy system at lowest societal cost. And I think that's the big benefit of energy system integration that we're looking for.
Yeah, and I'd like to add a little bit to that. We've done some pretty detailed modeling studies of large urban areas and other regions. Los Angeles, we just completed an LA 100 study to look at conversion of their energy system to 100% renewables. And one of the things we determined is that you can overcome with existing technologies the variability of solar and wind through a variety of different storage technologies. You can easily get up to 70, 80%. When you get to that last 5 to 10%, that's when you do need some of these combustion technologies that you can bring on when you have a very hot day, when you don't have your wind turbines running at that time. So that's definitely going to be important. And that modeling aspect, that evaluation of whole systems, and then looking at those extreme days when you have lower production and higher demand, and how do you incorporate those days, including the demand. You also want to look at that demand. How do you reduce that demand when you have lower production? So it's not just a one-way system. And if I have just a minute, I want to also put in a pitch for some of the renewables that we don't talk about as much that are non-variable. So geothermal, there's a lot of advances going on in geothermal, especially enhanced geothermal, that use the hydraulic fracturing technology developed in the oil and gas industry to create new geothermal reservoirs that there's not an existing ability reservoir in terms of where you need that porosity through the rock and you need to inject water. And we're doing a lot of research on how you can create new geothermal technologies in places where there's not a traditional reservoir, and that will provide a non-variable renewable source that can be incorporated in with the other energy sources. So I think that's another great way for the oil and gas industry to contribute into some of these new renewable technologies going forward.
Thank you. That's a very, very good example. Another good example of how the transferability of skills, technology, and innovation from one sector to the other in this new integrated energy system. If I can go back maybe to the slide with the poll, we can see, given the repurposing, still there at 49, so a little less, but it's still the first one. So we probably need to be realistic on the repurposing infrastructure, because I think there is potential there, but there are also limitations, and some of that came up in the past couple of days. So maybe René, you mentioned something about that, and Martin can talk about that as well in a minute. And then the second point was more about sharing infrastructure. So I wonder if maybe Jill and Giulio later can give us a bit of what the direction of travel is for sharing infrastructure across the different elements of the energy system. So maybe, René, can I start with you with the repurposing of infrastructure?
Yes. Yeah, and indeed, in theory, there's a lot of opportunities. We talked about repurposing platforms, pipelines, wells, depleted gas fields. Jill, you mentioned the geothermal applications. Indeed, we are also looking in Netherlands at repurposing old oil and gas wells into geothermal sources and producing from other layers. There is some limitation sometimes on the design of these wells and the sizing and the capacities that they can produce. If you look at the pipelines to repurpose them for CO2 and hydrogen, sometimes there's a challenge on the integrity of these pipelines, as they have been used for gas condensate or oil transport, even sometimes with solids, which deteriorates the quality of the pipeline. So there are sometimes limitations, and not to forget, there's a huge number of amounts of depleted gas fields in the Netherlands which may fit for CO2 storage. At the same time, the Mining Act requires the operators to actually abandon and decommission these fields once the gas production has stopped. And then they cannot be available anymore for CO2 storage unless there is a national strategy and a vision on which assets are strategic for repurposing applications in the future. So there has to be a national plan and a national strategy, and cannot leave it up to the market to keep assets at a cost for future use if there's not direct connection between the depletion of the field and the repurposing function for CO2 or hydrogen storage. So there's quite some challenges with the repurposing as well. But at the same time, I think there's much value in it if we can make it work.
And thank you for uncovering that, because of course, the challenges sometimes are related to the technology or to the materials, but often might be regulatory challenges or social challenges, also social acceptance sometimes. So maybe Martin, you can touch upon some of that, maybe in looking at what are the key barriers in reusing infrastructure from the oil and gas industry.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's already mentioned integrity is one of the key challenges. We actually did a study in 2019 funded by BEIS, a £500,000 grant from BEIS, and it's in partnership with industry looking at hydrogen offshore production. So I know that there's significant money being spent on combined wind and hydrogen systems at the moment, but if you look at the existing asset base offshore, yes, there's integrity challenges, but a lot of the structures, especially the concrete structures, could be reused for at least the next 30, 40, 50 years. So I think we need to make sure that we properly consider all alternatives before we decommission the infrastructure off there. Again, something Rennie touched on. And encouraging all the operators that we have partnerships with are looking at this actively now. So that's something that we can do internationally, and maybe pull in some of the learnings that TNO have from their own offshore hydrogen projects. We can have a much stronger business case for that.
Thank you. And as we mentioned, the second question, the second most voted answer in the poll was about sharing of infrastructure rather than specifically repurposing. Jill and Giulio later, what do you see the main opportunities but also the main barriers in shared infrastructure across the different parts of an energy integrated energy system?
I think on the midstream, one of the areas that we're looking at shared infrastructure is how do you reuse some of the pipelines for green methane, methane from landfills and dairy operations and those types of things. So that's an area that's being actively investigated. Obviously, those need to often be cleaned, and there need to be feeder lines put in to be able to do that. So there are a number of companies that are actually starting to explore about how do you actually share the methane transportation systems in that way. I think other things we've hit in terms of barriers of shared infrastructure is, land space, especially if you're looking at the downstream, the refineries and these types of areas, is how do you convert those, how do you incorporate renewables into those systems? And then also how do you convert those to producing bio-based materials and chemicals when they're currently producing hydrocarbon-based materials. So I think that's going to be some of the challenges in terms of how do you actually do that conversion. I think some of the concrete and other things and platforms will be a little bit simpler, but when you actually get into things where the chemical reactions could actually cause changes, and those are going to be much more challenging to try to convert.
Thank you. Giulio?
Well, now focus on the offshore case of Brazil. I think that we have a huge opportunity for sharing the infrastructure, as Julie just mentioned. If you consider, for instance, chemical reactions, we are now injecting gas in Brazil at a very high pressure because the fields are at more than 2,000 meters of water depth. And then you have already very high pressures. And then if you use those very high pressures that the equipment are already prepared to pump the gas for EOR at those very high pressures. And if you use that high pressure for process, and even process at the bottom of the sea that could, employ the methane and then to produce energy and gas to wire with ox-fuel and CCS on site, that would be a huge opportunity to sharing offshore infrastructure to do CCS and then to produce electricity. But the main problem, I believe, the main problem that must be overcome is the oil industry is extremely conservative. I don't know now if they, for a survival reason, they will have to be less conservative. I believe that they must survive and somehow. And then I think the problem to share that infrastructure is mainly related to the how they are conservative.
And if I can go maybe for the last question for this panel in the reverse order, so I'll start from you, Giulio, and then Martin and Jill, and finishing with René. You know, how can we collaborate on addressing some of these challenges? What do you expect to get from this partnership, from this working together over the next few months in the building this research and study? You know, what's your expectation and reason to get into this collaborative effort?
Well, I think sharing informations and sharing the case of each group, because Brazil is particular, but we have some, I just gave the example of the offshore and also the ethanol production in Brazil, that the path that we are following in terms of research, I think that could be applied to other regions. And this is, I think that is the main thing that we can gain with such collaboration. I think that to show what we believe that is a proper way for our case, and then to identify similar case and do the other way around as well. And I just learned a lot from the presentations yesterday, and then I think that we have many things that could be cross-applied.
Good. So the process started already. You know,
yes.
Martin, what do you expect from this collaboration?
Yeah, I mean, in a similar vein, I think I'm just really looking forward to myself and the wider team engaging with the experts across the globe. I think that there's so much knowledge to be shared. I mean, Jill touched on Los Angeles and the work they've done there. If you look at the offshore wind resource off the coast of California, there's fantastic offshore wind, quite often in deep waters close to shore. So some of the technologies that we're developing could potentially be applicable to that resource. I'm sure some of the ideas that they've got could be taken back here to the UK. So yeah, to me, time is precious, but I think this will be time well spent for us.
Excellent. So it's about accelerating also this transition, this innovation technology. Jill, I'll come to you next. Thank you for joining the effort, the joint effort. What do you want to get out of it?
The collaboration between, oh, goodness, I don't think so.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay. I think some of the, you can't have a conference call without somebody accidentally being on mute, of course. So I think what I'm looking forward to, and I think what's really exciting, is the collaboration between different sectors, the research world with industry. Whenever we work with industry, it's so important to learn to understand how technologies that are being developed at research institutes then get actually applied, and what are the decision making that industry makes, and what are the things that they need to know to make these technology selections and move forward in the transition. And then also, I think the multi-country aspect of this. I think the energy transition will be different in each location. And so there's so much we can learn from each other in terms of what Europe is doing and what North America is doing and what Australia is doing and Asia is doing, and how all these different approaches based on our different resources, our different knowledge bases, our different industry bases. So I think that's really important in terms of this collaboration of, we're going to learn a lot from each other in terms of how things can work in different locations, and how things, how we can bring knowledge from other places to our own locations. So I think that's going to be really exciting.
René, to conclude this round.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, I think what has been said is of course correct. We need to share the best practices and the knowledge that has been developed in different regions, coming from different backgrounds and with different boundary conditions, let's say, on this transition, making different choices, and maybe that's for a good reason, but maybe as we are working on the transition in the North Sea region, maybe also we have overlooked options that other regions have developed successfully. So it's also learning from one another. And I was very nice to hear from the minister who opened this session that the politicians sometimes should rely a little bit more on the sure hands of innovation and academia and science. So that's a big demand on us, I would say, but also we should be open for collaboration with the different institutes and knowledge and science centers around the world to be able to give the best advice to our politicians, so they can put the policies in place to really accelerate from Glasgow onwards to the next COP, and then we can present the results of this study in the next COP. I hope so. Thanks for the opportunity, Luca.
And I'd like to thank all our panelists, please, with a round of applause for their excellent debate. And we'll see Martin and Giulio again in the panel later, but for now we say goodbye to René and to Jill, but we'll see them very soon in the first workshop in a couple of weeks, because that's where we start really doing this project. Thank you very much. Thank you. So our next topic and our next panel is about hydrogen, is about CCUS, and it's about industrial decarbonization, key themes that emerged clearly from the past couple of days. And the number of hydrogen projects has risen massively in the recent years. Those are on stream, but was also going on stream. And CCUS is also finally getting traction, both associated with blue hydrogen production, but also to decarbonize industrial clusters, and focusing on those hard-to-abate sectors particularly. So what are the key technology priorities? And we have another poll for the audience, both here and online. What are the key technology priorities for industrial decarbonization by 2050? What we as technology research organization should focus on in order to make something cheaper, better, faster? And a few examples there: green hydrogen, which means hydrogen produced by renewables through electrolysis. Blue hydrogen, which is produced from natural gas with associated CCUS to get rid of the emissions. Or carbon capture from industrial emitters from the chimney stack. Or carbon utilization for materials and other purposes, so using that carbon instead of storing it. Or none of this and something else. If you can have, please, your vote of your favorite or your top priorities. And in the meantime, as before, I'll invite our panelists to join me. Here in the room, we have Mercedes Maroto-Valer, who's a champion and director of the Industrial Decarbonization Research and Innovation Centre, IDRIC, in Scotland. And Philippa Parmiter, program manager at the Scottish Carbon Capture and Storage Research Centre of Edinburgh. And then online, I'm glad to reconnect with a friend from yesterday. So Matteo Pasquali, Professor Matteo Pasquali, the director of the Rice University Carbon Hub in Houston. Good morning. And Lee Kennedy, National Cluster Development Manager at the National Energy Resources Australia, NERA. And also from Australia, Andrew Ross from CSIRO, the Commonwealth Scientific and Research Organization. And good evening to you. So maybe it's a time we have an opportunity to see if the votes have been casted already and what the priorities are. There you go. As for before, we have a clean winner, green hydrogen, so hydrogen from renewable sources. And carbon capture is second with for industrial emitters, so capturing the CO2 from industry. And carbon utilization has actually taken a good 30% or 29% of the votes, using carbon for material, 31 now, more for materials or for other purposes. Blue hydrogen is lagging a bit behind in 23%. So, as before, my first question is, does this surprise you? Do you agree with that? You have a different opinion. What is your reaction to that poll? Can I start maybe with you, Mercedes?
Yes, of course. I'm just going to declare that I was the one that said other. Maybe I was the only one in the room, I don't know, but let me say why I said other. It's because I think this is about, it's about all of the above. It's really about all the solutions that we need, and we really need to have a good toolbox. And that was very clear as well if you look at the UK hydrogen strategy and the twin track, and I think we just need to make sure that we develop all these technologies. I've been visiting the clusters, well, this was pre-pandemic, and it's really you have to understand that different clusters are going to have different priorities. And in some cases, the technology is going to be guided, or their option to choose a technology is actually going to be guided or restricted, depending how you look at that, from just maybe where they are located, the type of industries that are within their cluster. So I think it's just to try to fit a very complex challenge with lots of opportunities into just one single technology. I don't feel is quite the right approach. So I put my hand up, I said other, but that other was because I meant all of the above.
All of the above. And Philippa, can I come to you next? Your quote from the Scottish Carbon and Capture, so you might have a little bias towards that, but what's your reaction to that poll?
Good afternoon, and I'm very happy to be here. I just want to say that. I tend to agree with Mercedes. I actually put green hydrogen, not because I think that's the priority, for addressing industrial decarbonisation as such, but because I think that's where we need innovation most, maybe, to reduce the cost and increase the volumes. But obviously we need everything. We need to use everything and we need to move fast. So a lot of the technologies for industrial capture are already there, as Mercedes knows and would agree, I'm sure. And so we just need to be putting those into place, and maybe some of the barriers are less around innovation of technology and more around regulation and business models and public acceptance, as you keep mentioning.
Thank you. Since you mentioned green hydrogen, then maybe can we take a trip to Australia, because a lot of hydrogen was discussed yesterday, both blue and green. But take your perspective there, and what are the key technology innovation we need in green hydrogen and blue hydrogen to make it faster at scale? As always, I don't know which one to start with. I'll start with Lee. Can I start with you, Lee?
Thanks, Luca. And I actually hit other two, Mercedes, and my view on the other bit is around, sometimes we forget about the enabling infrastructure required to actually get these technologies commercialized and to scale. So that's the reason why I put other in there. But green hydrogen was the other one I ticked. And very similar to the previous panelists, we need all solutions. All technologies are part of the solution. There will be no silver bullet to decarbonising heavy industry. Whether it's renewables for some aspects of part of industry, and then hydrogen in the hard to abate, they're all required. And for Australia, it's going to be customer driven. And we're very lucky that we're so large that we've got different regions around Australia that are applicable and relevant for each of those different technologies. So we have that toolkit in Australia. And I guess the other lucky thing we have is we have domestic markets as well as export. So how do we help other regions and other companies around the Asia Pacific region actually decarbonise and meet their targets? So for me, there's lots of correct priorities and correct solutions around Australia. And I might hand it over to Andrew.
Yeah, I would just echo everything that everybody else has already said. You need that portfolio approach. You need a whole lot of different technologies. When we go to scale with some of the technologies that might not exactly work how we expect, or they might have a longer learning curve associated with them. So we have to have a whole portfolio of approaches. I expected green hydrogen to be the top of the list there, and I think in Australia we have an abundance of renewable resource available to us for that green hydrogen production. So that's going to be a really exciting time for us as we go forward, building that to scale. And we've got many major projects around the country that are on the drawing board, whether they actually come to fruition. But yeah, a very large amount of effort going in this country at the moment on green hydrogen development.
Thank you. Matteo, I'll come to you next, because there was a good result for the utilization of carbon, and we tend to see that it seems to be less advanced in terms of maturity than the storage. But we see some recent progress there, and we had yesterday actually the winner of our TechX startup competition been in reusing carbon for materials. So is that an area that you expect to be big and soon?
Depends on what you mean by carbon. Unfortunately, our languages have a big problem that we don't have a trade word for carbon dioxide. So we don't call methane carbon tetrahydrate, we call it methane. But carbon dioxide, we don't have a word, and so what has happened is now we are using carbon to measure carbon dioxide. And this has created a massive amount of confusion. So, and it's also related to the fact that we tend to decouple the carbon dioxide problem with the energy problem. Let me give you an example. We've been talking about green hydrogen. If we look into the future, to make green hydrogen, we need a lot of solar and wind. Green hydrogen is not a way to make energy, it's a way to convert solar and wind clean energy into chemical storage, which can then be used in various ways. If we use it to power electricity or vehicle, it's a cycle. And if we use it to decarbonize, say, steel production, it is a way where we have to provide additional energy. CO2 capture, for example, in an SMR, steam methane reforming plant, is a little bit different because it is a situation where one actually uses a fossil resource or biomethane if you have enough of it, and you can actually produce excess energy in forms of hydrogen that you need to run that process, even though you are capturing the CO2 and storing it. Now, once you decide to convert that CO2 back into carbon, then essentially you have to put back all the energy that came from the combustion. And so again, you're running a cycle, and it's a cycle that's even less efficient than the cycle that one runs with hydrogen. So it's very important to distinguish the technologies that use carbon directly. So starting from hydrocarbons, you split it. And this is also like the friends in Alberta were talking about. You split it, and you split it into a useful form of solid carbon and hydrogen from the technology that starts from CO2, which is essentially ore that has been fully depleted of any energy, and you have to put back all the energy in that has to come from somewhere, and you convert it into a material. Unfortunately, we do have this major lexicon problem. There has been historical efforts to try to separate the two, and in most communities, carbon dioxide and carbon are being distinguished well, not so well right now in our community.
So in other words, we're talking about the carbon or the carbon dioxide that we can capture from combustion processes. It's harder to reutilize and to making something useful, and we should probably prioritize CCS. Is that what?
No.
No? Okay.
It's not harder. It is a thermodynamic impossibility to make carbon from carbon dioxide at comparable efficiency from the energy you get from combusting carbon to carbon dioxide. So it's not harder, it is actually an energy sink. You need to put energy in that cycle. How much energy depends on how efficient you are, but you cannot beat that. It's like green hydrogen. You always have to put more energy into making green hydrogen that you can get back when you convert green hydrogen into water. If you start directly from hydrocarbons and you make solid carbon and hydrogen, because the hydrocarbons have stored the sun energy in the past via photosynthesis, you can actually win that game. You have to be efficient, but you can win that. So it's not a matter of how hard. It is also, there is an underlying thermodynamic basis that is being largely overlooked.
It's about taking the carbon out of the hydrocarbon and use it for materials or for useful purposes instead of burning energy with it, while we should accelerate, I think, on the carbon capture from the combustion process for storage purposes and removing from the atmosphere. I hope that summarizes better than before.
Yes, absolutely. And we should call it carbon dioxide capture.
Carbon dioxide. Excellent. So that opens the topic of blue hydrogen as well. You know? So we tend to have, and maybe that's I'd like to get your opinion, the impression that, you know, of course, green hydrogen is potentially the preferred options in the mid to long term, because of course it has no emission associated with it. But in the short and medium term, the amount of increase in the demand of electricity require that renewable electricity is used for electricity rather than producing hydrogen. And blue hydrogen can instead be a viable transition means to get that hydrogen into the system faster and in a cheaper and more controllable way from a scale perspective. Is that a fair assumption? Do you see, in other words, green hydrogen potentially leapfrogging blue hydrogen by 2050, or in the mid-term it will be more blue hydrogen than green? Who wants to go first?
I can take one for the team again to start, so that's fine. I think there are a couple of things to add to that question, Luca. I think one is that the challenge that we have here is really the scalability of the amount of hydrogen that we need to produce. And let me put that in the context of the UK. We are producing a very few gigawatts, if at all. If you take that into terawatts per hour, of course, you need to convert that. But right now, even the most conservative projections of how much hydrogen we are going to need are placing us in the order of 270 terawatts per hour minimum. What that means in terms of what we are producing now in the UK, it means we need to scale up at least an order of magnitude. And that's really the challenge here. And then we can start talking about the technologies, and we can start talking about how we are producing it. But then the other thing that we shouldn't forget in the discussion is what we are going to be using the hydrogen for. Okay? And I think that's really a key discussion not to lose sight of. Because are we going to use hydrogen to, I don't know, to run our shipping industry, our heavy trucks, for instance? Are we going to use it to take decarbonize heating in our homes? Or are we going to use it to decarbonize certain industrial sectors? And I think that's when you need to put all this full picture to really start thinking about when different technologies will have to come into place and how we can really follow a little bit of this twin track approach. But don't forget that we are not producing enough, and we need to be really smart into what we are going to use it. And I think when we have all that is when we start really kind of thinking in terms of windows of opportunity and what technologies will have to come first.
Thank you. Any opinion on that from Australia? I'll start with Andrew first this time and the Lee to follow and integrate.
I think we will start with blue hydrogen, to be quite honest, in many of the projects. And so where we have existing gas reserves, for example, I think it's a natural, very quick transition to generate hydrogen through SMR, for example. But over time, supplant that blue hydrogen with that renewable hydrogen once that infrastructure is built. And I think I said this yesterday, that using the low-cost hydrogen to build out infrastructure, which then can be used by higher-cost hydrogen over time, I think has a very significant economic benefit. And will allow adoption of hydrogen and building of the hydrogen supply chain much earlier than if it was just in some regions, not all, of course, but it will be a much quicker transition for certain regions.
I think just to carry on Andrew's comments there, it's in Australia, it's a lot around the customer. What does a customer actually want to procure? You know, are they happy with blue or do they want green? And you've got the likes of Twiggy Forrest, who's at COP26 right now, talking about deals around green hydrogen. But there are others in the market who are quite comfortable with blue today in the transition to green when costs do come down, when you do have to get to net zero by 2040 or 2050, whatever either the country or the corporation's net zero targets are. So yeah, I think it is a journey, and some are willing, who have that risk appetite, to go quicker through that journey, where others are wanting to maybe see how things play out first and take a lower risk appetite to that. So I think there is no one size fits all to that journey, but and I guess I reiterate why Australia is fantastic, because we do have the geology, the investors and the market for all these solutions to go at the pace of what customers are willing to invest in.
Thank you. Matteo, you want to maybe add something to the topic?
Yeah, I think that I agree that there's regional advantages and very much the point of what the customers want. I think actually, Luca, to go back to your issue as how far are we utilizing carbon as a solid rather than CO2. There are some big advantages. One is you never make waste, right? If you go from hydrocarbons to carbon and hydrogen. But there is another aspect, which is a customer demand that we're not used to using carbon as a solid in the pure form. We use plenty of polymers. We use our clothes are primarily carbon, our food is primarily carbon, but we don't use carbon as a material very much. There is a little bit of a niche market for carbon fibers, and then some electrochemistry market, like in batteries, some carbon black in tires. But they're very small markets, and so there's going to be a question of if we, as with technologies for using carbon as a solid, not combustible, but as a material, advance, how do we create incentives for customers to use that carbon as their base material? In the same way that right now we're creating incentives for using electric cars or switching to renewable electricity.
Thank you. This is getting complicated, isn't it? We have Filippo.
Hi. But I wanted to underline what Mercedes said about the need for a massive growth in hydrogen use. But we're talking in this situation, the question was around industrial decarbonisation, but we've also got to decarbonise residential heat and road haulage and shipping and trains. And hydrogen's going to be vital for some of these applications. And we already, in the UK, we have a gas grid, which has been predominantly upgraded recently with yellow polyethylene piping, which can be repurposed to put hydrogen through. So that's a massively simple way to decarbonise our residential heat infrastructure. And we already know that we can put 20% hydrogen into that grid without having to replace any of our household appliances. And as Stuart mentioned the other day, we have a trial going on in Scotland looking at putting 100% hydrogen into a housing estate, into 300 houses, and using it for heat and cooking. So these things we can do fast, and if we use blue hydrogen, we can do it faster. But we see that as a pathway to a transition away from fossil fuel use.
So Mercedes, are you colorblind when it comes to hydrogen, or do you have a preference?
Yes, I think, as I said, it's about this toolbox of solutions that we have to. But what I wanted to pick up is, I think, precisely sort of what Filippo was saying, and it was said also by the other panelists. We shouldn't forget that this is a trajectory, this is a journey that we are in. But we need to start the journey somewhere, right? And I think what is very clear in terms of where we start the journey, and this is for things from CCUS to hydrogen of whatever color, it's going to be in the industrial clusters. Because the industrial clusters, they already have the infrastructure, they already have the skills, and to many aspects, they are already producing some hydrogen. So I think what we need to be clear, this is a trajectory, there are options, there are optioning that we'll have to do in between, maybe better said that. But what we need to have is we need to start somewhere. So we couldn't just be thinking, where do we start? This is so complex. No, I think the answer to that is clear. We have to start now, and the best way to start is in the industrial clusters. And that's where we see that the industrial clusters is what you can see also from some of the UK government documents coming is really this concept of the super places. So it's these super places that are not going to be just for CCUS or hydrogen, are going to be for renewables, and they're going to be really at the forefront of this technology development. And they give us the infrastructure and they have the skills. So it's just really the best place to start the journey.
Thank you. And I think I need to, unfortunately, to get this panel to a closure because we need to go ahead. But is really maybe over-ambition to exhaust this argument in 15 minutes. But that's not wasn't the intention. The intention is to start the discussion, and we'll proceed in working together. And maybe I'll ask the same question that we asked to the previous panel. If you want to make a small, short last point that I see coming here, is how do we take this complexity of hydrogen, CCS, and industrial decarbonization to the next step from a technology innovation perspective? What do we do together better in the next few months to accelerate the pace of innovation here?
Shall I go first then?
Yes.
Take over from you, Mercedes. So I think we've been talking a lot about collaboration, sharing knowledge. I think it's absolutely key that we avoid duplication of effort. So because we have to move really, really quickly. So those are the three things we really need to do. And I think this could be demonstrated perhaps in the thinking about the offshore. So we've heard a lot about hydrogen production offshore, offshore wind, CO2 storage, potentially hydrogen storage as well. So we need to think about how we manage this shared space, about how we retain data from the oil and gas industry and reuse reservoir models, etc., wellbore data, how we decommission, how we reuse infrastructure, and all of this is shared knowledge. And we need to think about then how that feeds into regulation and public perception, and recognise that there are other users of that space, such as aquaculture, fishing, leisure, travel, etc., etc., and that we need to join all these up. And so we need this systems integration as well. And this incentive is a good way to try and build on that.
Thank you. Can I come to you next, Mercedes? And I'll go then to Australia again and conclude with Matteo.
So I think if maybe to add something new to the question here, already we talk about knowledge exchange, we talk about sharing all these ideas, the best lessons learned. I think for me maybe something that it hasn't come up yet, and I think it is really important as well, is that really the energy transition is going to be underpinned by a skills transition. And I think we need to be very good as well in terms of let's do technology and policy and regulatory frameworks, but is that a skills transition that is really going to be critical to take forward. So I think that is a huge piece of element that we could do coming together, from all the different, these 6 countries, 11 research centers, to really pull our heads together in terms of how we're really going to be taking forward this skills transition. I think that's maybe something to add, but pretty much as I started the panel, all of the above, I think probably everything that is going to be said as well.
Thank you. Lee.
Yeah, so I totally agree already, but one thing from me would be sharing tangible opportunities for technology companies to be a part of. So moving from just sharing information around what's going on to actually pulling and pushing companies into opportunities throughout this network and actually having companies leverage our relationships to solve problems. So Australian companies solving problems in the UK or US and likewise, and how you can create those global connections to even go into third markets, in Southeast Asia or other parts of the world that aren't in this network yet.
Thank you. Andrew?
I think there's a real good opportunity to not just share our science and innovation, but I think there's a real good opportunity to share different business models that are being used in different countries, different regulatory models that are being used in different countries, and allow the different participants to share those with their respective governments. I think that's really useful, and certainly we're seeing some of the conversations that we have in Australia with our government colleagues, where we take knowledge from different parts of the world and we bring those together, really quite fruitful and excellent sort of guidance on how we might develop things further.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Andrew. Matteo, can come to you to close this panel with your thoughts about how do we take the collaboration further?
I think the collaboration can be great for 3 points: roadmap, the risk, and deploy. So together we can have a much better way to look into the future and map these various pathways and try to understand the pros and cons of each one. At the same time, we can also try to de-risk them by doing our research, our economic and techno-economic analysis, our CO2 footprint analysis, try to get some parity between the systems. And then we can maybe not so much deploy ourselves, as most of us are organizations that are at the earlier technology level, but we can facilitate the deployment by working with industry clusters, etc. And on another, I would say, perpendicular angle, going back to what Mercedes was talking about, I think it's important to talk about the difference between transitional and endpoint technologies. So, and also the baggage that comes with transitional technologies, how do we manage it? Right now, we need to go to CO2 capture and sequestration, for example, to make hydrogen via SMR. Now, that's probably not going to be the endpoint in 50 years. If we're successful deploying all the solar and wind that we're setting out to deploy, and maybe some of these other technologies to make materials directly from hydrocarbons, etc., we probably will not need those technologies. But once those big clusters move and capital is put in place, people will want to see return. Like here in Houston, there's talk about a $100 billion cluster on CO2 capture and sequestration to decarbonize. If that cluster goes forward, that cluster is going to operate for 30 to 40 years because nobody will want to give it up, right? And so we also need to put that into the equation and see if we can understand how early decisions on transitional technologies can also have long-lasting impacts just because of inertia of large capital investments.
Thank you very much. And that, I think that point on the roadmap in the transition, the difference from this and the solution and the state is very, very important. That end of the second panel, and I'd like again to ask for an applause for our panelists. And thank you again for joining us late from Australia and early from the US and for being with us today. And I look forward to talking to you in the next workshop in a couple of weeks, as we said before. Thank you. Our next topic and the third and final panel is about oil and gas emissions reduction. And I think that is clear somehow, and Matteo made that point earlier, there's a transition, not a switch, that we'll have oil and gas in the system for some time, partly for energy and progressively more for the feedstock for some of the materials like carbon or carbon, as Matteo educated us in terms of using the right terminology. And so it is important that while we keep producing some of that oil and gas for these purposes, that oil and gas comes without the emissions that are normally associated with its production, so that it can be carbon-free oil and gas. And so the goal of the next panel is really understanding what are the technology priorities, where should we invest and innovate in order to accelerate the ability to produce that hydrocarbon without associated emissions. And so if you can go to the next poll, and the question is always the same, where should we start or what we should prioritize to make that happen? And the options are electrification from shore of offshore oil and gas platforms, or offshore renewables to power offshore installation, or hydrogen power installations. Another important point is, producing power for oil and gas is the main source of emission, but important is also flaring, and flaring control and elimination technology is that should that be a priority. And methane leaks, we heard yesterday the deal that was made at COP for methane, so that's also an important source of emissions that we should tackle. Or should we focus on the supply chain emission, all the helicopter, all the marine vessels, even the tankers that are across the sea, they're all burning fossil fuel. Or should we also look at the conversion of hydrocarbon molecule? And back to the point that Matteo was mentioning, and we're also exploring in Canada, in Alberta. So please cast your vote. What is your priority? And we'll use that as before to drive the discussion. And in the meantime, I'd like to welcome back on stage our panelist, Professor Giulio Meneghini, again, Scientific Director of the Research Center for Greenhouse Gas Innovation of São Paulo University in Brazil, and Martin Tulloch, Energy System Integration Program Lead at the Net Zero Technology Center. And online, joining us from Canada, so good morning to you, John Van Ham, Executive Director at Innotech Alberta, and Metzi Prince, Project Delivery Manager at the Energy Research and Innovation Newfoundland and Labrador. Thank you for being with us. So, can we check if we have the result of the poll? There you go. Powering oil and gas assets with renewable energy, first with a close competition from methane leaks containment technology. I think that also resonates well with what happened yesterday with the decision on the methane at COP. Flaring control in third position. See electrification from shore being quite low, which actually is in some part of the world at least very much used. So the question is, as always, does this surprise you? Is this reflect your priorities? Do you think this is where we should start? What are the priorities for your perspective? And this time I'll start with our guest online. Maybe John, can I come to you first and give a perspective of what are the region that is at the center of the oil sands in Alberta, in Canada, looking at in order to decarbonize the production of that hydrocarbon?
Yeah, thanks, Luca. I really appreciate the opportunity, and thanks everyone for being here today as well. I had a hard time looking at the Slido results, but I think I caught some of the points there. I think the point raised earlier by some of the other panelists around complexity of regional energy diversity. We heard it from Brazil, we heard it from Australia, the US, and some of the European countries as well. Really drives the point that there are many priorities. And depending on the regional context you're operating in, whether it's heavy electricity dependent, hydrocarbon dependent, what type of electricity, what type of hydrocarbon really drives the tech development you do. So I guess I'll just list off a couple of the priorities that we see here. First is reducing the emissions from existing oil and gas production. So that for us means novel hydrocarbon extraction processes, reducing the amount of energy we need to extract the energy from oil sands products or from other deposits. Number two is around methane and that taking that methane molecule and enabling the blue hydrogen world that people were talking about. We're already a large hydrogen producer in the province, and now it's about adding that carbon capture, utilization, and storage component to it as well. A third point around, following that was the methane molecule, following the heavy molecule, the heavier oil products, taking a part of that molecule and also converting it. So in the same way that you convert methane to hydrogen and carbon dioxide, as was rightly said earlier, also taking that heavier part of the barrel and converting it to carbon-based products as well. And a real opportunity, growing opportunities there. Small markets today, but real potential to grow into that. A fourth one is that integration of renewables with traditional or existing energy systems, wind, solar. Many of the regions that we heard from today also have very strong renewable energy opportunities and regimes. Strong wind, strong solar, geothermal, and small modular nuclear in some cases as well has a real opportunity to help with some of that. And then around repurposing, that's also where the methane leak part comes in as well. A real opportunity there for well sealant technology development for existing assets. When you're closing sites, making sure they're permanently closed, and also then repurposing them. And we see opportunities for repurposing sites for, again, coming back to solar opportunities, coming back to some wind opportunities. A lot of the infrastructure, maybe not necessarily the well sites, but the roadways, the right-of-ways for pipelines, for power lines, and so on. They follow the same roadways, and so you can really take advantage of that infrastructure to help, again, find those synergies, as I mentioned the other day, between existing energy systems and the assets we have today and the future energy system.
Excellent, thank you. And can I come to you, Matthew? Newfoundland and Labrador is made an offshore basin, on the contrary, and I think that has a similar challenge to the North Sea in terms of decarbonizing oil and gas production. So can you share what are the priorities of focus in order to decarbonize that production?
I think all of them are a priority, Luca. As you said, we are for operating assets with a new asset on the horizon or a new project on the horizon. But we have lots of similarities with the North Sea, and I think we're in early days. So right now we're managing our organization, Energy Research Innovation. We manage and facilitate projects on behalf of the oil and gas industry. But right now we're managing a program on behalf of the Government of Canada. So we have approximately 17 projects. 11 of those are technology development. If I had to say where is the highest priority for our new basin, because it's relatively new compared to the North Sea, I would say our priority right now is on digitalization. We see digitalization to our basin as a means to use process optimization, improve monitoring, so therefore reducing, having early detection, reducing leaks, and we also see digitalization for remote operations and, I guess, autonomous operations. If we look at where we are from using renewable power for our offshore environment, we have a lot of renewable energy. We have a new plant that just came on board for hydroelectric power. So we do have ample hydroelectric power. Unfortunately, it's on land. So our assets are 350 kilometers offshore. That in itself is a long distance for cables. But in addition, we have unique operating an environment here with lots of ice. So, if we look at bringing that renewable energy from hydroelectric power offshore, we'll be looking at laying cables in ice-infested waters where icebergs scour, there's evidence of icebergs scouring seabeds. And for wind turbines, wind-powered energy, we have a lot of pack ice that has to be managed. Now, this is a unique operating challenge for, just having the assets there in general. We do have increased, and probably maybe the world's best expertise in managing ice, towing icebergs, etc. But again, it's another complication to using renewable energy offshore. So right now, I think our portfolio of projects for technology projects are comprehensive. But if I had to say for what's our best bet or the best, out of everything right now, I would say digitalization is probably a very high priority for us.
Thank you. And it's something we haven't discussed much in the past couple of days, but clearly is an enabler and an unlocker of opportunities. And it's something that we're going to include in the study, in the collaboration going forward. Giulio and Martin, then, if I can ask you, what do you think is the top priority in decarbonizing oil and gas production in your region? Or the top technology or the top opportunity? Martin?
Yeah, I can go first. I think the results didn't surprise me. Quite encouraging to see those results. If we look at the offshore in the UK, and probably similar all over any offshore basin, but 75% of emissions come from power generation, quite often or almost always generated by low efficiency open cycle gas turbines. So that's got to be the key challenge. Power from shore is definitely an option. Can surprise maybe to see it down to the bottom. We've got really strong leadership in the UK from the Oil and Gas Authority. The first offshore basin to set a 2050 target and have a well thought through plan behind it. So power from shore has been compared previously to open heart surgery. It takes a huge amount of brownfield modifications. So again, it's really encouraging to see the OGA have a competition at the moment looking at decarbonising offshore oil and gas using floating wind. We've got a strong partnership with Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult. I see some colleagues in the room here today. So that is something we're working on together, looking at how do we get floating wind costs down so they can compete with other options offshore. Again, if you look at the market, it's a great stepping stone market. The cost of power offshore can be anything from 100 to 200 pounds per megawatt hour to produce your power offshore from gas. So that for a floating wind plant that can maybe get down to say 180, 150 today and hopefully a lot lower in the future, it's got to be an opportunity. Methane, of course, is the other thing that we've all mentioned. Maybe the remaining 20% of emissions, but hugely important as a greenhouse gas. 25% more potent, 25 times more potent, and with a much shorter lifetime. So again, great to see the decision yesterday. And those are the two key priorities to me.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because as you mentioned, the question of improving the efficiency, if you just say, well, I'd like just to say something about methane emission. That's one point that you just mentioned. Is a typical example. In our center, we developed a very simple technology at RCGI that's labyrinth seal design in order to avoid methane slip or methane fugitive emissions. And this is a very simple technology that has been developed using a transdisciplinary way. We just employed the tools that we had in aeronautical engineering to design better labyrinth seals, better seals. And then just some estimation by Shell, that's one of our founder sponsors, it could reduce with that very simple technology, you could reduce doing just a maintenance in the compressors by 60% methane emission. And that would be a huge gain if you just consider the very, very low cost of such maintenance and the use of that technology.
Excellent. Thank you. And I'm conscious of time and need to bring this to a closure, but I'd like to go to John and Metzi. I've asked you a question to you here before, but John and Metzi, what do you expect and to get from this collaboration, and why you're joining it, and what you want us to work on together in the next few months before COP27? I start with John and Metzi to close.
Okay, thanks, Luca. So again, I come back to all these regions, all these research and technology organizations from different parts of the world, all have experience in different operating basins, right? Where we have different mixes of electricity use, different types of power, different combinations of heavier or lighter hydrocarbons being developed, different end uses, whether it's for heat, power, mobility, petrochemicals, using petrochemicals and materials development and so on. Highly complex world that we're innovating in, and therefore working with others that are also doing work in that space, we're only going to be stronger together. It's something we're experiencing here in our own region in Western Canada. We're working quite closely with other partners. Alberta Innovates, our parent company, C4 Technologies is another subsidiary, CanMet Energy, which is our federal counterparts here in Western Canada, and the list goes on. And we've even just that regional collaboration that's happening within Western Canada is bearing very positive results for us and for our region. I see nothing but upside doing the same with other regional partners on this panel.
Thank you. Metzi?
I echo also what John just said, but I think it's important when I think about us as we're on the east coast of Canada. We're relatively, as I said, young jurisdiction for oil and gas industry. It's important for us that we are connected not only regionally but internationally to understand what other regions are doing. No one wants to reinvent the wheel when it's time to pick technology projects to move forward. So it's really important to know what everyone else is doing, where we need technology specifically for our region or anyone's region, right? Some things can be used only here, or some things can be, what we're developing can be used globally, and vice versa. So I think it's so important to stay connected. It's impossible to, read everything that's going on without actually being connected, because you hear so much more. So that's why we're part of this project. We want to bring back information to our local stakeholders, our local government, the oil and gas operators that we work with. I think this is important for them. Of course, everyone has their sources, but the more information you have, the more we share, the more chance we are going to have, or the better chance we're going to have to actually reaching our goal.
Excellent. And with that manifesto for collaboration, Metzi, I'll close this panel, and I thank you very much, both of you, and look forward to see you in the next workshop when we start actually doing this work on this study. And I'll thank you also, Martin and Julia, for being on the panel today. So thank you very much. So that concludes our third and last panel, and also concludes our summit. And I think it's been 3 days of fantastic knowledge sharing and discussion. But as we said before, this is the start and not the conclusion of that collaboration. But I think I'd like to close with just a couple of things. What have we learned, or what I have learned? I think we learned that the oil and gas industry has a role to play to get us to net zero, but it needs to transform into an integrated energy system. I think we learned that we need technology innovation to help in that transformation, and we need to accelerate that innovation, and that we can do it by collaborating across the world, as we have been doing in the past 3 days. And I think one thing I also learned that is it is possible to collaborate remotely. It is possible to mix people in the room and on the other side of the world and have a meaningful and constructive collaboration. And I think that also happens not by chance. It happens thanks to the hard work of the team, and I'd like to thank the team behind the scene for making that work and making that work seamlessly. And I'm moving to the thanks then. And so I'd like to thank all of our panelists and presenters over the 3 days. And of course, end up thanking you, audience, live again, but also all the people that are following us online. And so, as I said, this marks the end of the summit, but it is the beginning of the collaboration. And so I'd like to close maybe by showing again the short video about the collaborative study that we're launching today and that we're going to start working in the next weeks. And with that is all from us in Glasgow, and thank you very much to the people online and to you in the room. Thank you.